Welcome. I trust you are ready for a new mystery to unfold.
Murder at the Halloween Ball. Chapter 1. The Invitation That Changed Everything. Good evening, dear listeners. I'm Stephen, your host here at Cozy Mysteries, and tonight I bring you a tale that unfolds beneath glittering chandeliers and behind silken masks, a story of vanity, ambition, and murder, most theatrical. Our tale begins on an autumn evening in Paris, when the city's elite gathered for what they believed would be the social event of the season. Little did they know that before the clock struck midnight, elegance would give way to horror. The invitation arrived on a crisp October morning at the modest apartment where the world's most meticulous detective resided during his Parisian sojourn. The envelope bore the mark of Maison Lavelle, the celebrated fashion house whose creations adorned royalty and cinema stars alike. Inside, embossed in gold, was an invitation to the annual Halloween masquerade ball, an event so exclusive that mere wealth could not guarantee attendance. The detective studied the card with his characteristic precision, noting the quality of the paper, the subtle perfume that clung to it, and the handwritten note at the bottom. "Monsieur Poirot," it read, "your presence would honour us greatly. We face a delicate matter that requires your particular talents. Please attend, discretion assured. Yours, Céleste Lavelle." His friend and companion expressed surprise at the invitation. After all, costume balls were hardly the detective's preferred entertainment. He valued order, routine, and above all, the opportunity to observe human nature without the interference of elaborate disguises. Yet something in that handwritten note intrigued him. A woman of Madame Lavelle's stature did not casually request assistance. The week preceding, the ball passed in preparation. The detective insisted on creating his own costume, a Renaissance scholar complete with a modest mask that would not impede his vision or his famous moustaches. He made discreet inquiries about Maison Lavelle and its proprietress. What he discovered painted a picture of remarkable success, shadowed by recent troubles. Céleste Lavelle had transformed her late husband's modest dressmaking shop into an empire of haute couture. Now, in her middle years, she remained the face and creative force of the house. However, rumours whispered of financial difficulties, stolen designs, and bitter rivalries within the fashion world. Her chief competitor, Victor Arnault of Maison Arnault, had recently unveiled a collection that bore suspicious similarities to sketches that had disappeared from Lavelle's studio months earlier. The evening of the ball arrived with a chill wind sweeping through Parisian streets. The detective arrived at the Palais de Glace precisely at 8 o'clock, neither early nor fashionably late. The venue itself was a marvel, a former ice palace transformed into a Gothic wonderland of black velvet, crimson roses, and hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows across the walls. As he entered, the detective's sharp eyes immediately began cataloguing details that others overlooked. The positioning of the musicians, the exits and entrances, the servants moving with practiced efficiency through the crowd. Somewhere in this glittering assembly, danger lurked behind a painted smile. The evening's mystery had begun. Chapter 2. A Gallery of Masks. The ballroom presented a spectacle that would have delighted artists and overwhelmed ordinary observers. Our detective, however, viewed it through a different lens, one that saw patterns where others saw only chaos and detected falsehood beneath the finest veneers. Guests arrived in an endless parade of elaborate costumes. Marie Antoinettes mingled with Egyptian pharaohs, while Venetian nobles conversed with medieval knights. The anonymity of masks emboldened some guests and made others visibly uncomfortable. Yet for a detective trained to read the smallest gestures, the masks proved less concealing than their wearers imagined. Near the entrance, Madame Lavelle herself held court, resplendent in a costume representing the Queen of the Night from Mozart's opera. Her gown was a masterpiece of midnight blue silk adorned with silver stars, and her mask glittered with what appeared to be hundreds of tiny pearls arranged in constellation patterns. The detective noted how she touched the mask frequently, as though ensuring it remained properly secured. She greeted him with evident relief, her voice low beneath the music. "Monsieur Poirot, I am grateful you came. I must speak with you privately, but not yet. There are too many eyes watching. After the first waltz, Meet me in the conservatory. Please be careful whom you trust this evening." Before he could respond, she swept away to greet a new arrival, a tall man dressed as a Spanish conquistador, his bearing suggesting military training despite the costume. The detective made a mental note to identify this guest later. The champagne flowed freely, carried on silver trays by waiters dressed as ravens. Our detective accepted a glass but did not drink, preferring to observe how alcohol loosened tongues and lowered guards. He positioned himself near a marble column that offered an excellent vantage point of the entire ballroom. From this position, he observed several individuals of interest. A woman in a Cleopatra costume spoke intensely with a gentleman dressed as Napoleon, their body language suggesting an argument barely contained by social propriety. Near the orchestra, a red devil engaged in animated conversation with a white angel. The irony was not lost on our observer. Most intriguing was a figure dressed entirely in black, wearing a plague doctor's mask with its characteristic long beak. This person stood alone in various corners of the room, never speaking to anyone, yet somehow watching everyone. The detective recognized the behavior of someone conducting surveillance and wondered whether this guest shared his purpose. The orchestra began tuning their instruments, signaling the approach of the first dance. According to tradition, Madame Lavelle would lead the opening waltz with a partner of her choosing. The detective positioned himself where he could observe both the dance floor and the path to the conservatory. As the first notes of the waltz began, Madame Lavelle stepped forward with her chosen partner, a man dressed as a Renaissance prince, his costume rivaling hers in magnificence. They took their position at the center of the floor as other couples formed around them. The detective watched with interest, noting the precision of the timing, the placement of the musicians, and the way certain guests positioned themselves around the room. Everything about this evening felt choreographed, as though he were watching a play where not all the actors knew their parts. The dance began, and with it, the countdown to catastrophe. Chapter 3. The Waltz of Death. The music swelled through the ballroom as couples swept across the polished floor in time-honored patterns. Our detective observed from his vantage point, his eyes moving methodically from one detail to the next, assembling a mental picture of the evening that would prove crucial in the hours to come. Madame Lavelle and her partner commanded attention at the center of the floor. She moved with practiced grace, her elaborate costume flowing perfectly with each turn. The pearls on her mask caught the candlelight, creating tiny stars that seemed to orbit her face as she spun. The detective noted how she maintained her composure, despite the intensity with which her partner held her, perhaps too intensely for mere dance. Halfway through the waltz, a waiter appeared with a tray of champagne glasses. He moved along the edge of the dance floor with practiced efficiency, offering refreshments to those who had chosen to watch rather than participate. The detective observed that the glasses were arranged in a specific pattern on the tray, alternating between tall flutes and shorter coupes. At precisely the moment when the music reached its crescendo, Madame Lavelle and her partner paused near the refreshment table. Her partner reached for 2 glasses from a passing tray, both tall flutes, and offered one to her with a bow. She accepted it gracefully, raised it in a silent toast, and took a delicate sip. The detective's attention sharpened. Something in the gesture struck him as wrong, though he could not immediately identify what disturbed him. He began moving closer, navigating the perimeter of the dance floor with the excuse of seeking a better view. The dancers resumed their waltz, but now the detective noticed a change in Madame Lavelle's movements. She stumbled slightly, then recovered. Her partner's grip on her waist tightened, whether in support or control was unclear. The pearls on her mask seemed to blur as she turned, as though the detective's vision had suddenly become unreliable. Then, with a grace that seemed almost theatrical, she collapsed. Her partner caught her, preventing her fall, but champagne spilled across her costume in a golden cascade. For a moment, everyone in the ballroom stood frozen, as though uncertain whether this was part of some elaborate performance. The detective reached them in seconds, his trained eye immediately assessing the situation. Madame Lavelle lay in her partner's arms, her breathing shallow, her eyes unfocused behind the mask. But it was the dark stain spreading across her costume that commanded his attention, a stain too deep, too red to be champagne alone. "Call for a doctor immediately," he commanded with authority that cut through the shocked murmurs, "and no one leaves this room." As guests began to react with horror and confusion, the detective knelt beside the fallen woman. He noted several crucial details. The champagne glass she had dropped lay unbroken on the floor, still half full. Her elaborate mask had shifted slightly, and one pearl from the constellation pattern was missing, and most tellingly, a small tear in her costume near the ribs revealed the source of blood. Her partner, the Renaissance prince, seemed genuinely shocked. "I don't understand," he stammered. "We were dancing, she drank champagne, and then—" His voice trailed off as realization dawned. My God, someone has poisoned her. But the detective's examination suggested something more complex. The wound was small, precise, like that made by a thin blade or perhaps a long hatpin, weapons easily concealed in elaborate costumes. The question was, when had the blow been struck? During the dance, when bodies pressed close together, or earlier, with the effects delayed until this theatrical moment? The music had stopped entirely now, leaving only whispers and the rustle of costumes as guests pressed forward, morbid curiosity overcoming social propriety. The detective stood, his mind already working through possibilities, eliminating impossibilities, constructing theories. Madame Lavelle had wanted to speak with him privately. Now she might never have that chance. Whatever secret she had intended to share had died with her. Or had it? Perhaps, the detective mused, the message lay not in words she might have spoken, but in the carefully orchestrated manner of her death. He looked around the ballroom at the masked faces, knowing that one of them concealed a killer. Chapter 4: The Pearl and the Puzzle. While others stood paralyzed by shock, our detective moved with purpose. Every moment that passed allowed the killer to adjust their demeanor, to compose the mask within the mask. He had learned long ago that the moments immediately following a crime often revealed more truth than hours of later interrogation. The doctor arrived within minutes, though his examination merely confirmed what was already apparent. Madame Lavelle had been stabbed, the blade entering precisely between her ribs. Death had not been immediate. Rather, she had been dancing with her killer for perhaps 2 or 3 minutes before collapse. The champagne, analysis would later confirm, contained no poison. It was merely a prop in a more elaborate performance. The detective knelt again beside the fallen woman, this time examining her mask with delicate precision. The missing pearl troubled him. Its absence created a gap in the constellation pattern, a void where the star representing Polaris should have been. Had it fallen during the collapse, or had it been removed earlier? And if removed, by whom and for what purpose? He instructed the staff to search the immediate area, but the pearl was not found. This fact he filed away in the methodical catalogue his brain maintained, certain it would prove significant. Meanwhile, he had requested that all guests remain in the ballroom. The police had been summoned, but he knew they would be delayed. Paris was celebrating All Hallows' Eve with particular enthusiasm this year, and the authorities had their hands full. This gave him perhaps an hour to observe, to question, to piece together the pattern before official procedures obscured the truth. The Renaissance prince who had been Madame Lavelle's dance partner was questioned first. He identified himself as Bernard Mercier, a wealthy industrialist and longtime patron of Maison Lavelle. His distress appeared genuine, but the detective had learned that the best actors often were those with most to hide. "We were dancing normally," Mercier explained, his hands trembling slightly. "She seemed perfectly well. When we paused for champagne, I noticed nothing unusual. The glasses were on a tray. I simply took 2 and offered her 1. We toasted silently, as one does during a dance, and continued. Then she stumbled, and I thought perhaps her costume had tangled, but—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The blood. I saw the blood and knew something terrible had happened." The detective noted that Mercier wore gloves, as did many guests. Convenient for concealing evidence, though hardly unusual for such an event. He asked about Mercier's relationship with Madame Lavelle, and learned of substantial financial investments in her fashion house, investments that would now be at risk. Next, he spoke with the waiter who had served the champagne. The young man was terrified, insisting he had merely followed instructions. Madame Lavelle herself had specified which tray should circulate during the first waltz, and which glasses should be positioned where. This detail intrigued the detective immensely. Had the victim somehow orchestrated the timing of her own death? The plague doctor in black had vanished. Several guests recalled seeing the distinctive costume earlier, but none could confirm its presence after the collapse. The detective dispatched staff to search the entire venue, but the mysterious figure had apparently departed. As he continued his inquiries, a pattern began to emerge, not in the answers, but in their absence. Too many guests claimed to have been watching the dance, yet none had noticed anything unusual. Either the killer had been extraordinarily subtle, or witnesses were lying. Both possibilities deserved consideration. A commotion near the entrance drew his attention. A woman in a Cleopatra costume was demanding to leave, insisting she had an important engagement. The detective recognized her from his earlier observations, the same woman he had seen arguing with Napoleon. He moved to intercept her. "Madame, I must insist you remain. The police will want to speak with everyone present." She turned, and even through the mask he could see fury in her eyes. "I am Marguerite Arnault," she declared with cold authority. "My brother is Victor Arnault. We have nothing to do with this tragic accident, and I will not—" "Accident." The detective's voice was gentle but firm. "Madame Lavelle was murdered, and given the well-known rivalry between your brother's house and hers, I think the police will be most interested in speaking with both of you." Marguerite's expression hardened. "How dare you suggest—" But the detective had already turned away, his mind occupied with a new question. Why had a member of the Arnault family attended their chief rival's ball? The puzzle was becoming more complex, and somewhere in the swirling details lay a single pearl that might unlock everything. Chapter 5. Secrets in Silk. The conservatory where Madame Lavelle had planned her private meeting stood silent, its exotic plants casting strange shadows in the lamplight. Our detective made his way there, reasoning that even in death the victim might still reveal her secrets if one knew where to look. The room was a marvel of glass and iron, filled with orchids and ferns from distant lands. The air hung heavy with moisture and perfume, creating an atmosphere both beautiful and oppressive. The detective moved methodically through the space, examining surfaces, checking for disturbances, seeking anything that might explain why this location had been chosen for a clandestine conversation. Behind a large palm he discovered what he sought, a small writing desk, and upon it a letter partially concealed beneath a designed sketch. The letter was addressed to Madame Lavelle and bore no signature, but its contents made the detective's eyes narrow with interest. "Your silence can be purchased," it read, "but the price rises daily. The blueprints were never yours alone, and the world will soon know the truth. Meet me at the ball, and we will discuss terms one final time. Refuse, and I will destroy you as you destroyed me." The detective photographed the letter with his mind, noting the quality of the paper, the style of handwriting, and most importantly, what it revealed about Madame Lavelle's state of mind. She had been facing blackmail, though the nature of the blueprints mentioned remained unclear. The design sketch beneath the letter showed an elaborate evening gown, but certain technical notations caught his attention. They were written in a different hand than Madame Lavelle's, and referenced construction techniques that seemed unusually innovative. Here, perhaps, was the source of conflict. A sound at the conservatory entrance made him turn. The woman in the Cleopatra costume, Marguerite Arnault, stood watching him, having somehow evaded the supervision he had arranged. Her mask was now removed, revealing a face marked by intelligence and determination. "You are clever, Monsieur Poirot," she said, entering uninvited. "You know my name, but do not know my story. Allow me to enlighten you, as I believe Celeste's death has freed me from certain obligations of discretion." She moved to the desk, her fingers touching the letter without picking it up. "My brother Victor and I were once students of Madame Lavelle. This was years ago, before she became famous, when she was simply Céleste Mercier. Yes, the same family as tonight's unfortunate dance partner, though they were distant cousins only. Victor fell in love with her, foolishly. He shared with her his most innovative designs, techniques he had developed for creating garments that moved like water, that seemed to defy gravity itself." The detective listened without interruption, noting how she positioned herself between him and the exit, whether from strategic thinking or nervous habit, he could not yet determine. Celeste used those techniques, Marguerite continued, bitterness creeping into her voice. She built her empire on Victor's genius, and when he demanded recognition, she denied everything. She claimed the designs were hers, that Victor was simply a jealous former student seeking reflected glory. Society believed her, of course. A beautiful woman with royal clients against an unknown young man. There was no contest. And the blueprints mentioned in this letter? Marguerite smiled coldly. Victor kept meticulous records, drawings, notes, everything. When Celeste's star continued to rise, he threatened to publish them, to prove his claims. She had him arrested for theft of her intellectual property. The case was dismissed for lack of evidence, but Victor's reputation was destroyed. He rebuilt his career slowly, painfully, and yes, we attended tonight, hoping to finally expose her. Hoping or planning? There is a difference, monsieur, between hoping for justice and committing murder. She met his gaze directly. I did not kill Celeste Lavelle. Neither did Victor. We wanted her exposed, humiliated, financially ruined, but alive to suffer those consequences. Her death helps us nothing. The detective considered this carefully. The logic was sound, yet logic and truth were not always companions. Where is your brother now? Fled, probably. Marguerite's composure cracked slightly. He panicked when the body was discovered. He knew suspicion would fall on him, immediately, and he has already endured one false arrest. I stayed to face the questions he was too frightened to answer. Before the detective could respond, a servant appeared at the door, breathless. Monsieur Poirot, you must come quickly. We have found something in Madame Lavelle's private dressing room. Something that changes everything. As they hurried through ornate corridors, the detective reflected on Marguerite's revelation. The fashion world, he was learning, harboured rivalries as deadly as any he had encountered. But rivalry alone did not explain the theatrical nature of this crime, the precise timing, the missing pearl. The dressing-room door stood open, and inside, scattered across a velvet chaise, lay dozens of pearls, identical to those on Madame Lavelle's mask. And beside them, a document that would indeed change everything, a new will, dated just 3 days earlier, leaving the entire Maison Lavelle not to family or partners, but to Bernard Mercier, the man who had held her as she died. The detective's famous little grey cells began working with renewed intensity. The pattern was becoming clearer, though several pieces remained tantalizingly out of reach. Most puzzling of all was the question, why would Madame Lavelle arrange her own death to appear as murder? Chapter 6. The Dancing Killer's Alibi. Dawn approached as our detective gathered the principal players in Madame Lavelle's private atelier, a room usually forbidden to all but the most trusted. Here, amid dress forms draped in unfinished creations and walls covered with sketches, he would reconstruct not just a murder, but the careful deception that surrounded it. Present were Bernard Mercier, still wearing his Renaissance costume though his mask lay discarded, Marguerite Arnaud, defiant and watchful, the head waiter who had served the champagne, and Inspector Girard of the Paris police, who had finally arrived and proved both irritated and intrigued by the detective's preliminary investigation. Let us begin, the detective announced, by establishing what we know to be true, separating it from what we have assumed. Madame Lavelle collapsed during the first waltz after drinking champagne. She had been stabbed with a thin blade, the wound inflicted with sufficient precision to suggest medical knowledge or professional training. She died within minutes of falling, though the injury itself was inflicted earlier. Inspector Girard nodded. The physician confirmed the blade entered between the ribs, but not during the dance itself. The angle and depth suggest she was standing still, possibly even sitting, when struck. The subsequent movement of dancing caused internal damage that led to her collapse. This revelation caused visible reaction in the room. Bernard Mercier's face drained of colour. You mean she was already dying when she chose me as her dance partner? But why? Why not call for help immediately? An excellent question, the detective responded. One that leads us to the will discovered in her dressing room, Monsieur Mercier. A will that makes you sole heir to one of Paris's most valuable fashion houses. You were her dance partner, the last person to be alone with her, and you benefited enormously from her death, yet I do not believe you killed her. You don't, Mercier stammered. But the evidence was arranged to implicate you, or someone like you. Consider, Madame Lavelle specified which champagne tray should circulate during the waltz. She chose you as her partner. She ensured the death would appear to occur during the dance, creating a perfect tableau of suspicion. Why construct such an elaborate scene unless the true killer needed misdirection? Marguerite Arnault leaned forward. Are you suggesting Celeste orchestrated her own murder scene? I am suggesting she knew she was dying and chose to control the circumstances of her death. But to what end? The detective began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. Let us examine the champagne. Monsieur, you served the glasses personally? The head waiter nodded nervously. As instructed, monsieur. Madame Lavelle was most specific about the arrangement, the tall flutes in alternating positions with the coupes. She said it was for aesthetic purposes, that the varying heights would create a more pleasing visual effect. Yet Monsieur Mercier selected 2 tall flutes both from the same tray. Tell me, were there any coupes on that particular tray? I believe there were, monsieur. Yes, definitely, but he chose the flutes. The detective turned to Mercier. Why did you select those specific glasses? I don't know. Habit, perhaps. Celeste preferred the flutes. She said they showed the champagne's bubbles to better effect. I simply took what I knew she liked. Precisely. You acted according to pattern, according to expectation. But what if someone had taken a coupe instead? What if the pattern had been broken? The detective moved to the sketches on the wall, studying them. Madame Lavelle built her empire on understanding patterns, in fabric, in design, in human behavior. She knew you would select the flutes, Monsieur Mercier. Just as she knew that drinking champagne during a waltz would appear perfectly natural, creating no suspicion until it was too late. Inspector Girard frowned. But if she was already stabbed before the dance, where was she attacked? And by whom? Where is answered by the missing pearl from her mask, a pearl that I believe was not lost during her collapse, but removed earlier, deliberately, to mark the location of the attack. If we search this very room with sufficient care, I suspect we will find it, placed where she could easily see it, a reminder of her own mortality even as she prepared for the ball. The detective moved to a large armoire, opening it to reveal rows of completed gowns. Behind them, barely visible, hung a mirror, and affixed the mirror's frame with a single pin was the missing pearl, positioned at eye level, exactly where Madame Lavelle would have seen it while adjusting her mask. She was stabbed here, the detective announced quietly, in her own atelier before the ball even began. She then dressed, attended the event, and choreographed her death to occur in the most public, most theatrical manner possible. But the question remains, who wielded the blade, and why did she protect them with her dying breath? The room fell silent as the implications settled over them like the silk drapes surrounding them. Someone had stabbed Madame Lavelle, yet she had chosen not to identify them, instead creating an elaborate scene that pointed suspicion elsewhere. The detective understood that the dying woman had left him a puzzle, one that required understanding not just the mechanics of murder, but the complex motives that drove someone to kill and someone else to conceal that crime even at the cost of their own life. The truth, he knew, lay somewhere in the intersection of love, loyalty, and the secrets that the fashion world concealed beneath its beautiful exterior. Chapter 7. The Designer's Final Collection. The morning sun filtered through the atelier's tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny ghosts among the fabric. A detective stood before the mirror where the pearl had been found, reconstructing in his mind the moments before Madame Lavelle departed, for what she knew would be her final appearance. Monsieur Poirot, Inspector Girard's voice interrupted his contemplation. We have completed the search you requested. There is something you should see. They moved to Madame Lavelle's private office, a smaller room adjacent to the atelier. Here the inspector had assembled a collection of items, correspondence spanning several years, financial ledgers showing the house's precarious position, and most significantly, a locked wooden box that had been concealed beneath a floorboard. The detective examined the box with interest. It was perhaps 12 inches long, made of rosewood, and secured with a mechanism that suggested Japanese craftsmanship. After a moment's study, he manipulated the hidden release, and the box opened to reveal its contents. Inside lay 3 items: a faded photograph showing a much younger Celeste Lavelle with a handsome man and a small boy, a military medal from the Great War, and a series of letters written in a masculine hand. The detective read them carefully, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "These letters," he said finally, "are from her husband, the original Monsieur Lavelle, who died in the war. But look at the dates. The last letter is from 1918, but this box also contains correspondence from recent months, also in his handwriting." "Impossible," Marguerite Arnault interjected, having been permitted to remain as a material witness. "Antoine Lavelle died at Verdun. His death was confirmed." "Was it?" The detective held up one of the recent letters to the light, examining the paper quality. "Or was it simply convenient to believe so? Tell me, Madame Arnault, you knew the Lavelles in those early days. Did you ever meet Monsieur Lavelle?" Marguerite hesitated. "Once or twice, briefly. He was often away, even before the war. Celeste said he was travelling for fabrics, exotic materials from the East, but—" She trailed off, a memory clearly surfacing. "But," the detective prompted gently, "there was something odd about those travels. Victor once mentioned that Antoine Lavelle seemed to know a suspicious amount about textile manufacturing techniques that were, at the time, closely guarded secrets in Japan and China, as though he had not merely purchased fabrics, but learned the methods of their creation." The detective nodded slowly. "Industrial espionage masked as merchant trading, a common practice in those years, and a dangerous one. What if Antoine Lavelle did not die at Verdun? What if he was captured, or went into hiding, or assumed a new identity for reasons we can only speculate? And what if, years later, he returned?" He gestured to the recent letters. "These speak of a man who had been watching from a distance, who knew of the empire built in his name but could not claim it. They speak of medical problems, of time running short, and in the final letter, dated 2 weeks ago, he writes, 'I can wait no longer. We must meet one last time, or I shall be forced to reveal the truth you have worked so hard to conceal.'" Bernard Mercier, who had been listening intently, suddenly stood. "The plague doctor," he said quietly. "At the ball. There was someone in a plague doctor costume. I saw them speaking with Celeste early in the evening before the dancing began. She seemed distressed afterward." The detective's eyes gleamed with interest. "Describe this plague doctor, please." "Tall, thin. The costume was well made, but theatrical, not from any professional house. And the voice. When I passed near them, I heard the voice. It was strange, almost mechanical, as though filtered through the mask itself. Or," the detective suggested, "as though the speaker were disguising their natural voice. A voice that might otherwise be recognized, perhaps. Tell me, Monsieur Mercier, you were a distant cousin of Madame Lavelle's late husband. Did you ever meet him?" Mercier shook his head. "Antoine was much older than Celeste, and from a different branch of the family. By the time I was old enough to attend family gatherings, he was already at war." The detective turned to the window, watching the Paris morning unfold below. The pieces were assembling themselves now, forming a picture both tragic and complex. A husband returned from the dead, bearing secrets that could destroy the empire built in his absence. A woman who had perhaps loved him once but had moved beyond that love, creating a new identity, a new life, and a final meeting at a masquerade ball, where anonymity was not just accepted but expected. "Inspector," he said after a long moment, "I believe we must search for the plague doctor costume. It will not be far. The person who wore it had neither time nor opportunity to dispose of it properly. And when we find it, we will find the answer to our final question. Why did Madame Lavelle choose to die publicly while protecting her killer?" "You know who killed her?" Gerard demanded. "I know who held the blade," the detective corrected. "But the designation of killer may be more complex than our legal system typically allows. Come, we have work to do, and the truth will not wait much longer." As they prepared to resume the search, the detective paused before the dress forms wearing Madame Lavelle's final unfinished designs. Each was a masterpiece, incorporating techniques that seemed decades ahead of their time. He wondered if these innovations had come from the mysterious Antoine Lavelle, smuggled back from the East, or if Celeste herself had developed them. Perhaps it did not matter. In death, as in life, she had woven together truth and fabrication so skillfully that separating them might prove impossible. The answer, he suspected, would be as carefully constructed as the gowns themselves. Chapter 8. The Plague Doctor's Confession. The costume was discovered exactly where our detective predicted it would be, in a storage room adjacent to the conservatory, hastily concealed beneath a pile of tablecloths used for catering. The long-beaked mask still bore traces of theatrical makeup, and inside the robe they found something unexpected: bloodstains and a hollow compartment sewn into the lining, sized precisely for a thin blade. "This costume was prepared specifically for murder," Inspector Gerard observed, examining the hidden pocket. "The killer came to the ball armed and ready." The detective shook his head slightly. "Or the costume was prepared for defense and became a tool of murder only when circumstances demanded. There is a distinction worth considering." He instructed that the costume be brought to Madame Lavelle's office, where the principal witnesses were already assembled. To these he had added several staff members who had been present during the ball's preparation, and one additional figure whose attendance he had specially requested, a priest from the nearby church of Saint-Sulpice. When all were settled, the detective began his explanation, his voice carrying the weight of revelations carefully constructed. "We have learned," he said, "that Madame Lavelle's husband, Antoine, supposedly died at Verdun, yet evidence suggests he survived and, after years abroad, returned to Paris seeking recognition of his contributions to the Maison Lavelle's success. The recent letters prove they were in communication. The costume we discovered proves someone came to the ball intending either to threaten or to silence him. But which?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air. "Consider the logistics of the crime. Madame Lavelle was stabbed in her atelier before the ball began. The wound was precise, inflicted by someone with knowledge of anatomy. Yet she did not cry out, did not call for help. Instead, she carefully completed her costume, attended the ball, and arranged her death to occur during the first waltz. Why?" Bernard Mercier spoke hesitantly. "To protect someone." "Precisely. But whom?" The obvious answer, that she protected her killer, raises an impossible paradox. Why would she shield the person who murdered her? Unless... The detective turned to the priest. "Father Dominic, would you please tell us what Madame Lavelle discussed with you 3 days ago, when she came to your church?" The elderly priest looked uncomfortable, but nodded. "She came for confession, though she had not practiced her faith actively in many years. What she confessed must remain private, but I can say that she spoke of a terrible sin committed long ago, one that had borne bitter fruit. She wished to make amends before it was too late." "And did she mention a husband?" the detective prompted gently. "She mentioned a man she had wronged, a man who had given her everything, whom she had betrayed in the cruelest possible way." The priest's voice was heavy with sorrow. "She said this man had returned seeking justice, and that she intended to give it to him." The detective nodded slowly. Antoine Lavelle did not die at Verdun. He was captured, imprisoned in conditions that broke his health irreparably. When he finally escaped and made his way back to France years later, he discovered that his wife had declared him dead, built an empire using techniques he had shared with her, and had no intention of acknowledging either his survival or his contributions. For years, he lived in poverty while she prospered. Finally, with his health failing, he demanded recognition. Marguerite Arnaud gasped. Then the blueprint theft my brother was accused of was perhaps inspired by Antoine Lavelle's legitimate grievance, yes. Your brother heard rumours of a man who claimed his designs had been stolen by Madame Lavelle. It gave him courage to make his own accusations. But we digress. The detective's gaze swept the room. 3 days before the ball, Madame Lavelle made her new will, leaving everything to Bernard Mercier. Why? "I don't understand any of this," Mercier protested. "Celeste and I were friends, nothing more. I helped finance her business, but I never expected—" "You are her husband's cousin," the detective interrupted quietly. "Perhaps distant, but family nonetheless. She knew she was dying, not from murder, but from illness. The physician's report confirms she had advanced cancer, untreatable, with perhaps weeks to live. She chose to give the Maison Lavelle to you because you represented the family she had wronged. It was her attempt at restitution. Inspector Girard frowned. But if she was already dying, why the elaborate murder scene? Because, the detective said softly, she needed to protect the person who stabbed her, not from justice, but from their own conscience. He moved to the window, gathering his thoughts before delivering the final truth. Antoine Lavelle came to the ball as the plague doctor. He met his wife in her atelier, intending to confront her one final time. But Céleste had prepared for this meeting. She told him of her illness, of her decision to leave everything to his family, of her deep regret. And then she did something extraordinary. She handed him a blade and asked him to kill her. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. The detective raised his hand for silence. She explained that her death by cancer would be slow and undignified. She wished to die quickly to spare herself that suffering. But more than that, she wished to give Antoine what he had sought for years: recognition. She told him that she would arrange the scene to appear as murder during the ball, creating a mystery that would bring investigators, publicity, and attention to the Maison Lavelle's origins. She would leave documents, letters, evidence that would eventually reveal the truth, that Antoine Lavelle was the true genius behind many of the house's innovations. But that's, Girard began. Assisted suicide, the detective finished. Indeed, which is why Antoine Lavelle could not allow her plan to proceed as she wished. You see, despite everything, he loved her still. When she pressed the blade into his hands and guided it to her ribs, he pulled away. The wound was inflicted, but not fatally, not immediately. She had hoped to die there in the atelier. Instead, the blade barely penetrated. She was wounded, but could have survived with medical attention. The detective's expression grew somber. So, she modified her plan. She attended the ball, danced as arranged, and allowed the combination of movement and delayed hemorrhaging to achieve what the blade alone had not. She died protecting Antoine from the knowledge that he had failed even in this final act. She died ensuring that the scene would indeed create the mystery she wanted, while making it impossible for investigators to identify the plague doctor who had already fled in horror at what he had done. Father Dominic made the sign of the cross. She sought redemption through sacrifice. Even in death she tried to repair what she had broken. "Where is he now?" Mercier asked quietly. "Antoine Lavelle?" The detective withdrew a telegram from his pocket. This arrived an hour ago from a hospital in Marseille. Antoine Lavelle admitted himself yesterday, gravely ill, and requested that a message be sent to me. He confessed to attempting to kill his wife and provided a full written statement. He died 2 hours later. The room fell into heavy silence, broken finally by Inspector Girard. So we have a murder victim who orchestrated her own death, and a killer who was manipulated into the act but who died before he could be charged. What am I to put in my report, Monsieur Poirot? The detective considered carefully. You will report the truth as we have discovered it, that Madame Lavelle died from complications of a stab wound inflicted during a confrontation with a person since deceased. You will note that she had arranged elaborate misdirection to conceal the identity of her attacker. You will include all documents and evidence we have collected, and you will let the prosecutors decide what charges, if any, could even theoretically be filed against a dead man for assisting in what was partially a suicide. He turned to Mercier. The Maison Lavelle is yours now, monsieur. With it comes a responsibility. The documents Madame Lavelle left will prove that many of the house's most innovative techniques came from Antoine Lavelle. I trust you will ensure he receives the recognition he deserves. Mercier nodded, visibly moved. I will, and perhaps I can reach out to Monsieur Arnaud. If there are others whose contributions were overlooked, whose designs were used without credit, this house should make amends for those injustices as well. Victor Arnaud stepped forward from the doorway, where he had been standing unnoticed. I returned, he said simply, to face whatever accusations would come. But if you mean what you say, Monsieur Mercier, then perhaps something good can emerge from this tragedy after all." As the meeting dissolved, the detective remained by the window, watching the Paris streets below. The case was solved, yet he felt no satisfaction. 2 lives had ended, one in pain and regret, another in grief and failure. The truth had been revealed, but it brought no triumph, only a melancholy understanding of human complexity. Inspector Gerard approached him. "You knew from the beginning, didn't you, that Madame Lavelle wanted to die?" "I suspected when I saw how carefully she had choreographed the scene. A woman who designs costumes for a living understands the power of presentation. She designed her death as carefully as any gown, ensuring maximum impact while concealing the truth at its center." "And the pearl? The one missing from her mask?" The detective smiled faintly. "That was her final message, a deliberate imperfection in an otherwise perfect design, placed where only I would understand its significance. Polaris, the North Star, the fixed point by which sailors navigate. She was telling me where to begin my investigation, at the fixed point of her atelier, where the true story began. Even in death she was guiding me to the truth she wanted revealed." As he prepared to depart, the detective paused before one of Madame Lavelle's final designs, a gown of midnight blue scattered with pearl constellations, now complete. Somewhere in Paris, he knew, documents would soon be published revealing the contributions of Antoine Lavelle and others whose genius had been obscured. The fashion world would be scandalized, reputations would be rehabilitated, and perhaps some small measure of justice would be achieved. But for Celeste and Antoine Lavelle, it had come too late. Chapter 9. The Threads Unravel. 3 weeks had passed since that Halloween night, and our detective found himself once again in the atelier of Maison Lavelle, though it had begun the transformation to Maison Mercier Lavelle, honouring both the family name and the new direction. Bernard Mercier had requested this meeting, and the detective had agreed, curious what loose ends might remain. The space had been partially cleared. Many of Madame Lavelle's personal items had been catalogued and preserved, including the unfinished designs that now formed the centerpiece of a memorial exhibition. Mercier stood beside a large table covered with documents, his expression troubled. "Monsieur Poirot, I've been reviewing Celeste's papers as you suggested," he began without preamble. "The financial records, the correspondence, the design archives, and I've discovered something that troubles me deeply. Something that suggests our understanding of that night may still be incomplete." The detective settled into a chair with interest. "Please, continue." Mercier spread several documents across the table. "These are Antoine Lavelle's original sketches and technical notes, dating from before the war. They are brilliant, innovative, exactly as you described. But look at this." He placed another set of sketches beside them. "These are from Celeste's private collection, dated from the same period. They show identical techniques, but the handwriting is clearly hers." The detective examined both sets carefully, his eyes narrowing. "You are suggesting that perhaps the innovations were collaborative, rather than solely Antoine's?" "More than that. Look at the progression. Antoine's notes show him working through problems, making mistakes, refining ideas. But Celeste's show the completed solutions. What if she was not merely copying his work, but improving it? What if the truth is more complex than Antoine believed?" This revelation troubled the detective more than he liked to admit. "Do you have other evidence of this?" Mercier nodded grimly. "I found letters from textile manufacturers in Japan and China, dated during the war years. They are addressed to Celeste, thanking her for technical inquiries and observations. Monsieur Poirot, she continued the research after Antoine disappeared. She developed the techniques further, created new applications. The Maison Lavelle's success was built on both their contributions, but Antoine, imprisoned and isolated, knew only what had existed when he left. He never knew how far she had taken their shared vision." The detective stood and moved to the window, processing this new information. Below, Paris continued its eternal dance of light and shadow. "Then Madame Lavelle carried a double burden," he said finally. "Not only the guilt of declaring her husband dead and building an empire in his absence, but the knowledge that he would never understand how much of that empire was truly her own creation, she could not defend herself without appearing to diminish his contributions further. "There is more." Mercier's voice was heavy. "I found a medical file hidden among her personal papers. Antoine Lavelle did not develop his illness in imprisonment as we assumed. He had tuberculosis before the war, a fact he concealed when he enlisted. The conditions of his captivity worsened it, certainly, but he was already dying. Celeste knew this when she married him." "Ah," breathed the detective, understanding dawning. "She married a dying man who had brilliant ideas but lacked the strength to execute them. She took his innovations and built upon them, always knowing he would likely not survive to see their fruition. When he was reported dead, she grieved, but also saw an opportunity. Perhaps she convinced herself he truly had died, that the reports were accurate." Mercier added softly, "And when he returned, vengeful and bitter, believing she had stolen everything from him, she could not tell him the full truth. How do you explain to a dying man that his wife surpassed him, that she took his seeds and grew a garden he could never have cultivated himself? It would have appeared as the cruelest insult." The detective returned to the table, examining the sketches with new eyes. The complexity of human relationships, he reflected, often exceeded even the most intricate mysteries. "What will you do with this information?" "I will tell the truth," Mercier said firmly. "The exhibition will show both their contributions. The documents will be published with proper context. Antoine Lavelle deserves recognition for his innovations, but Celeste deserves recognition for her development of those innovations into something greater. They were partners in creation, even if circumstances drove them apart." "A Solomon's judgment," the detective observed, "but I think a fair one. Though I wonder—" "Yes?" "I wonder if Madame Lavelle foresaw this. She was, as we have established, a woman who planned carefully. Perhaps she knew that honest examination of the records would reveal this more complex truth. Perhaps that was part of her final design, to create a mystery that would force such examination." Before Mercier could respond, Marguerite Arnaud entered, followed by her brother Victor. Both wore expressions of nervous determination. "Forgive the intrusion," Marguerite said, "but we heard you were meeting, Monsieur Mercier, and we wish to add something to the record before it is finalized." Victor stepped forward, holding a portfolio. "These are my original designs, the ones I claimed Celeste Lavelle stole. I've examined them again, honestly, comparing them to her work from the same period. And I must confess that while she may have been inspired by my ideas, she transformed them into something distinctly her own. My accusation was born of pride and jealousy, not truth." Marguerite added quietly, "We came to understand, watching Monsieur Poirot investigate, that the fashion world is built on inspiration and transformation. No designer creates entirely alone. We draw from those who came before, from those around us. The line between inspiration and theft is often unclear. Celeste may have been guilty of failing to acknowledge sources, but so have many of us." The detective smiled slightly. "A generous admission, and one that I think Madame Lavelle would have appreciated." "There is something else," Victor continued. "I've been reviewing my own records, and I discovered that some of my techniques, the ones I was most proud of, were actually refinements of ideas I encountered in my apprenticeship years. Ideas that came from sketches I saw in Celeste's early studio, before she became famous. It is possible that I too built my career partially on her uncredited foundations. We may all be in debt to each other in ways we never acknowledged." The room fell silent as they contemplated this interconnection. The detective thought of the pearl constellation on Madame Lavelle's mask, individual points of light that formed meaning only in relation to each other. Perhaps that was the final truth she had wanted revealed, that creativity was not a solitary act but a web of influences, inspirations and transformations. "Monsieur Mercier," the detective said, "I believe you have a unique opportunity. The Maison Mercier Lavelle can become more than a fashion house. It can become a place where contributions are acknowledged, where the web of creativity is honored rather than concealed, where young designers receive credit and support rather than having their ideas absorbed without recognition." Mercier nodded thoughtfully. "A foundation, perhaps, to support and credit emerging designers, to document the history of techniques and innovations, to ensure that what happened to Antoine Lavelle and to Victor Arnault does not happen to others. The Lavelle Foundation, Marguerite suggested, named for both Celeste and Antoine, honouring their complex legacy. As the three of them began discussing practicalities, the detective quietly withdrew. His role in this affair had ended. The murder was solved, the truth revealed, and now the living would determine how to honour the dead. Outside, Paris sparkled in the afternoon light. Somewhere in this city, the detective knew other mysteries were unfolding, other secrets concealed behind beautiful facades. But for now, he was content to walk the boulevards, to observe without judging, to appreciate the complexity of human nature in all its contradictory glory. The case of the Halloween ball had taught him something valuable, that truth was rarely simple, that justice was often incomplete, and that the most carefully designed facades sometimes concealed not villainy, but tragedy. Madame Lavelle had orchestrated her death to reveal certain truths while concealing others, and even after all his investigation, he suspected some mysteries would remain forever hidden beneath layers of silk and secrets. As the great detective disappeared into the Parisian crowd, one might say he carried with him not triumph but wisdom, and perhaps that was the greater victory after all. Chapter 10. The Final Design. The evening of the memorial exhibition arrived with autumn rain washing the Paris streets. Our detective had not initially planned to attend, but a personal invitation from Bernard Mercier had persuaded him. As he entered the transformed atelier, now a gallery space, he found himself impressed by the careful curation. The exhibition was titled Constellations, the Legacy of Antoine and Céleste Lavelle, and it told their story through designs, documents, and personal artifacts arranged chronologically. The early section showed Antoine's original sketches alongside Céleste's interpretations and extensions. The middle section documented the war years, with letters from suppliers and Céleste's increasingly sophisticated technical drawings. The final section displayed the masterpieces that had made Maison Lavelle famous, each now carefully annotated to show which techniques originated with Antoine, which with Céleste, and which represented their collaboration filtered through time and distance. The centerpiece was Madame Lavelle's final design, the midnight blue gown scattered with pearl constellations. It hung in a glass case, spotlit from above, with the matching mask displayed beside it. But now a single pearl had been added to fill the gap where Polaris should have been, and beneath it an inscription read, "Every star in a constellation guides sailors home, but none more essential than the North Star, the fixed point that makes navigation possible. This gown represents the fixed points in our lives, love, betrayal, redemption, and the hope that even our failures might illuminate the path for others." The detective stood before this display for a long moment, appreciating its poetry. A voice beside him interrupted his contemplation. "Monsieur Poirot, I hoped you would come." He turned to find a woman of perhaps 60 years, elegantly dressed in an understated manner that suggested refined taste rather than fashion-following. She offered her hand with a sad smile. "I am Madame Delacroix, though I was born Jeanne Lavelle, Antoine's younger sister. I returned from America when I heard of Céleste's death and my brother's confession. I wanted to see for myself what had become of their story." The detective took her hand gently. "My condolences, madame, for both your losses." "Thank you. I have been studying this exhibition with great interest. Monsieur Mercier has been most kind in sharing documents with me, including letters between Céleste and Antoine from their early courtship. Reading them, I begin to understand what happened to these two people who loved each other, but were destroyed by circumstance and pride." She gestured toward the gown. "When they married, they were true partners. Antoine was the innovator, full of ideas but impatient with execution. Céleste was the perfectionist, capable of taking rough concepts and refining them into reality. Together, they were formidable. Apart, she trailed off sadly. Apart, each believed they had been the essential element," the detective finished gently. "Precisely. Antoine's imprisonment gave him years to dwell on his contributions, to forget Céleste's role in their success. He convinced himself she had stolen everything. Meanwhile, Céleste, building the business alone, convinced herself that she had been the true genius, that Antoine's ideas had been merely seeds requiring her cultivation. Both were partially right and entirely wrong. Madame Delacroix moved to another display, a collection of letters. But I found something among Antoine's possessions that suggests at the end he understood. A letter he wrote but never sent, dated the day before the ball. He wrote, "I have lived these years in bitterness, believing myself robbed of recognition. But today I saw photographs of Celeste's latest designs, and I recognized in them not theft but transformation. She took what we created together and made it soar beyond anything I could have imagined. My pride told me she stole my brilliance, but truth tells me we created brilliance together, and she continued creating it alone. I go to her tomorrow, not for confrontation, but for reconciliation. If she will forgive me my accusations, perhaps we can acknowledge each other's contributions honestly at last." The detective felt a profound sadness. So he went to the ball seeking peace, not vengeance. Yes, which makes the tragedy even more terrible. Celeste, not knowing his change of heart, offered him the blade as a path to the justice she thought he sought. He, horrified, could not refuse without revealing how wrong he had been about her. And so two people who might finally have found peace instead created a final, terrible misunderstanding. They stood in silence for a moment before Madame Delacroix continued. "But perhaps some good has come from it. This exhibition, the foundation being established, the honest accounting of credit and contribution. These would not have happened without their tragedy forcing such examination." The fashion world is beginning to discuss these issues publicly. Other designers are acknowledging their influences and inspirations. It is a small change, but meaningful. "Madame Lavelle's final design," the detective murmured. "Not a gown, but a reformation of an industry." "Perhaps. I choose to believe so." She paused, then added, "There is one more thing I wish to tell you, Monsieur Poirot. Among Celeste's papers, I found a sealed letter addressed to you. Monsieur Mercier gave it to me to deliver." She withdrew an envelope from her handbag and handed it to him. The detective examined it. Fine paper, his name written in an elegant hand, sealed with wax bearing the Maison Lavelle mark. He opened it carefully. The letter inside was brief. "Monsieur Poirot, if you are reading this, then my final design has unfolded as planned. You have discovered the truth of Antoine's return, of the blade, of the choreographed death. But I suspect you have also discovered more than I intended, the complexity of credit and contribution, the impossibility of simple answers to questions of creation and ownership. This is as it should be. I did not arrange this mystery merely to protect Antoine or to achieve recognition for him. I arranged it to force examination of the very questions that destroyed our marriage and our partnership. Who creates? Who owns? Who deserves credit? In the fashion world, as in all artistic endeavors, we build upon the work of others while claiming originality. We take inspirations and call them our own. We collaborate but seek individual glory. Antoine and I were guilty of this, as are most who achieve success in creative fields. If my death creates a conversation about these issues, about attribution, about collaboration, about the complex web of influences that shapes all creation, then perhaps something meaningful will come from my final collection. The missing pearl from my mask was my message to you. Look for the fixed point, the North Star around which everything else revolves. That fixed point is not a person, but a question. How do we honor all the contributors to beauty while still celebrating individual achievement? I do not have an answer, but I hope the asking might be my final contribution to the world I loved. With gratitude for your brilliance and hope for your understanding, Celeste Lavelle. The detective folded the letter carefully, his expression thoughtful. So Madame Lavelle had anticipated even this, his discovery of the deeper complexities, his wrestling with questions beyond simple guilt and innocence. She had designed her death to be not just a mystery, but a meditation on creation itself. She was remarkable, Madame Delacroix said softly, having read the letter over his shoulder. Flawed, certainly, prideful, undoubtedly, but remarkable nonetheless. They both were, the detective replied, and perhaps that is the truest lesson. that remarkable people create remarkable messes as often as they create remarkable beauty, and we must find ways to honour both truths simultaneously. The exhibition opening continued around them, guests admiring the designs and discussing the documented history. The detective noticed Victor and Marguerite Arnault in conversation with young designers, apparently offering mentorship and support. Bernard Mercier was explaining the Foundation's mission to a group of journalists. The tragedy of Halloween night was transforming into something more complex. Not redemption, exactly, but perhaps evolution. As the detective prepared to depart, he paused one final time before the midnight blue gown with its constellation of pearls. Madame Lavelle had indeed created a final masterpiece, though not the one she had worn to the ball. This masterpiece was woven from truth and tragedy, from questions without simple answers, from the acknowledgement that creativity was both individual and collective, both original and derivative, both theft and transformation. The North Star Pearl caught the light, sending tiny sparks across the darkened gallery. Navigation, the detective reflected, required both a fixed point and the wisdom to understand that the journey mattered as much as the destination. "Au revoir, Madame Lavelle," he whispered to the dress. "Your final collection is complete." And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped out into the rainy Paris night, leaving behind a mystery solved but never truly finished. For the best mysteries he had learned were those that continued to ask questions long after the final revelation. This has been a Cozy Mysteries production. I'm Stephen, and I thank you for joining me in unravelling the threads of murder at the Halloween ball. Until our next mystery together, may your curiosity remain keen and your deductions impeccable. Bonsoir.